everyone. Welcome to episode 233 of the Book Cougars, two middle-aged women on the hunt for a good read. I'm Emily.
And I'm Chris.
And we are going to jump right in. Chris, what are you currently reading?
I'm currently reading The Good House by Tananarive Due, which is our second quarter read-along. I'm just over the halfway point, and I'm enjoying it very much, but it is kind of a slow read. I mean, there's some creepy moments. It is dealing with things that are happening in a house that are impacting people, let's say that, who are maybe not necessarily even in the house sometimes. I don't know. I don't want to say too much because I don't know too much. A couple listeners have finished it already. And Brooke said that it was a slow read, but she enjoyed it and she was always happy to go back to it. And that's exactly how I feel. Like, I'm always happy to pick it up at night when it's time to read, but it's not exactly a page turner. I guess it's more of like a slow burn Stephen King novel, and it has shades of Stephen King. You could tell he's an influence on her writing.
Very cool. I can't wait to start it. And have you dipped into the audiobook at all?
I have not.
Okay, I'm going to do that.
Yeah, but Karen then said that the ending is going to lead to a really good conversation when we have our Zoom discussion on June 8th.
I cannot wait.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be coming up for me soon, but I haven't opened it yet. I'm reading Leaving by Roxana Robinson. This one, if you've read the novel Our Souls at Night by Kent Harif, this is reminding me a lot of that because it is about Warren and Sarah, who were in love in their youth, late in high school and into their early college years, but broke up. And the book opens where they run into each other at intermission at the opera. And they're in their 60s now, completely different time in their lives. And they get together to have dinner to catch up. And it's really interesting. The writing is very observational in style. When they're at that dinner, they're observing this table next to them with a father and daughter and stepmother, where they're having this really uncomfortable conversation. You know, one of those where like the stepmother is really angry and she wants the father to take her side, but it's the father of the daughter, you know. So she really observes behavior well, and I'm enjoying the writing very much. Again, it's called Leaving by Roxana Robinson.
Well, I'm proud of you because you got that one recently, didn't you?
I did.
And you're reading it already. That's pretty cool.
I'm going through one of those phases that you talked about, I think a couple months ago, where I just keep picking things up and starting them, and they're not working for me. So when I started reading this one, I was like, okay, this is it. This is going for me. I think something's going on in my reading life, or maybe it's an age thing, or becoming a grandmother. I don't know, where it's just like some things, like particularly early 20s or mid-20s, like angst, I'm just not interested in reading at all. So I had picked up a novel that was dealing with some of that and had to put it down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's when I tried to reread The Catcher in the Rye, an older adult, it was not working.
Yeah, times in our lives, right?
Yeah.
I also have in my hands the Bean Book, 100 Recipes for Cooking with All Kinds of Beans from the Rancho Gordo Kitchen. And this is by Steve Sando and Julia Newberry. Rancho Gordo is this incredible bean company out of California. If you know, you know, because their bags have this really cool art on them, and they have the most beautiful heirloom beans. I know that they became incredibly popular during the pandemic because people started cooking beans a lot. And they have a bean club, and I know from people who were members that they were selling out of a lot of their beans. I wonder if things have kind of calmed down a little bit in their business, but this cookbook is so beautiful. I'm really excited. I've just been reading the story of how the company started is in the beginning of the cookbook, so I've gotten through that part, but I haven't even gotten really to the recipes and deciding which one I'm going to start with. So I'll report back.
Excellent. I look forward to that. And I know a lot of people are posting beautiful bean dishes.
Yes. Yes. They're also just good for you.
Totally.
So Chris, what did you just read?
I read a graphic memoir. This is Ephemera, a memoir by Brianna Lowenson. And it's a beautiful cover. I think that's what attracted me at first, because it's all different shades of green with leaves and vines. Very muted. And the art within is also rather muted colors. It is a memoir of her growing up, and she was a very apparently lonely child. She had a sibling, a brother who I think might have been a little bit older. I'm not sure. They look very similar in age. And the mom was, I'm not sure if she suffered from depression or alcoholism, but there was something going on where mom was gone a lot. Like, she would just leave. She'd come back, and then she'd be gone again. There's not another parent in the picture. It's just mom. And the girl survives by being involved with plants. Her mom had been a gardener, and she's very interested in gardening and plants, and that's kind of what saves her. Set in a garden, a forest, and a greenhouse, Ephemera drifts between a grown woman's early childhood memories and the gossamer existence of a mother struggling with mental illness. Brianna Lowenson's debut memoir is an aching, lyrical, and beautiful graphic novel. And that's a great description right there.
I love the word gossamer also. Beautiful.
The dedication is for my mom and other things that were not built to last. It's a beautiful book, but it is unsettling. So again, that's Ephemera, just one of my favorite words to say, by Brianna Lowenson. And this is published by Fantagraphics.
I know, I love saying "and other ephemera." Yes, that's a great sentence. I finished Food Person by Adam Roberts. This is the one that has the most incredible cover of like a gingham tablecloth and a plate of spaghetti with a comb running through it. And Adam Roberts is very involved in the food world, but this is his debut novel. And just when I said that I was having trouble reading, 20-something angst, well, this book worked for me. And I think it's because there's a lot happening in this novel. There are two main characters, Isabella Pasternak and Molly Babcock. And Isabella is a cook. She's working at a magazine that's kind of a gossipy magazine, but in the culinary world. And then Molly Babcock was once a famous TV personality and has kind of fallen as TV personalities can. Her arc has been up and is now down. But this is just past the time of the pandemic. And during the pandemic, she started cooking on Instagram. So to try to piggyback on that fame, she's going to write a cookbook. And Isabella, who's the writer, is hired to be her ghostwriter. And then quickly learns that Molly can't really cook, which is a problem. So it really ends up being poignant because both of the women discover that they've lost someone important to them. In Molly's case, it's her mother, and in Isabella's case, it's her father. And so they kind of are able to see each other's humanity based on that. So there is a thread of grief through the novel. It's not like anything that brought me to tears. It just made the novel more poignant. And then Isabella also has a mother who's kind of gone off the deep end because she and her husband, Isabella's father, were madly in love and had a really great marriage. And she's lost her husband and is floundering. So I enjoyed it a lot. There is food in it. There's things that happen that are very unexpected. And Adam Roberts also definitely is, I think you say, poking the bear of, what the food world is today. So he drops a lot of names of cooks that are out there in the world in real life, real names. He does not hesitate and really is looking, there's a lot of people now that are becoming food celebrities because of their social media presence. And then there's also just an expectation that if you're going to write a cookbook, you need to be marketing yourself and have some sort of a following in order for it to, sell books. I really enjoyed this book. I slurped it up in like 2 sittings. Food Person by Adam Roberts. You can pre-order it now. It pubs on May 20th.
Nice. Well, we read a couple things in common. One being our ghost story.
By Charles Dickens.
Yes. This one is called Number 1 Branch Line, The Signal Man. And this was first published in 1866.
Yes, and I did a little research, and Mr. Dickens was actually in a train derailment in 1865. So it made me wonder if that's part of what the genesis of this short story was.
Oh, that's so interesting. I have a note. I've been just writing like a little note here and there on the, like, just below the title of the stories we're reading. And I say, no dog, but there is a dead, beautiful young lady. Which is, Mr. Poe's must.
Yes, exactly.
But yeah, so this one, I mean, it is interesting. And I wonder if in that train derailment, if somebody did die.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't do further research about that.
Yeah.
But definitely after I read that, I thought, oh, interesting. That could be where this whole thing comes from. So let's start with, did you like it?
It was meh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I listened to it twice and I read it once. And all 3 times I was like, there's not much here.
Right. And the writing is just so sometimes kind of convoluted, especially compared to the last story where I thought the prose was very readable and smooth. That was The North Mail by Amelia B. Edwards. Mm-hmm. So the content and the writing style both were not highly appealing to me.
I agree. Should we give just a little synopsis about what the story is about without spoilers?
Yeah, sure. So some unnamed narrator who's out for a walk, apparently, and he sees a signalman down below, like I'm picturing like a mountainside or a big hill that was gouged out that the railroad's going through. And so on either side of the track is the stone that's, weeping water. It's very moist and earthy down there.
Yes, I marked the sentence. It was made through a clammy stone that became oozier and wetter as I went down.
Yeah.
Which I thought, ooh, this bodes well. But then it didn't get, I don't know. I was hoping it'd be oozy, wet, and creepy, the whole story.
Right. Yeah. And it wasn't, it was very much telling us what happened. And I got the sense that the narrator was a very unimaginative fellow. Probably your, everyman type character. Because one of his early thoughts is wondering if the signalman had an infection in his mind.
Loved that sentence.
Yes. And then he also wondered if he was a spirit at one point, which then at the end of the story, you're kind of like, okay. So was he a spirit? Wasn't he? Is the narrator a spirit? Isn't he?
Right, because the signalman also thinks he might see a spirit, right?
Yeah, the signalman has 2 circumstances where he sees something and then something happens.
Right.
And he's seeing this other thing now and he's like, I don't know what it means. I don't know what it means. And then you find out what it means. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But yeah, infection in his mind. That was probably my favorite line of the story.
That was my favorite, that line and the oozier and wetter. Those are the 2 lines that I liked. And so I think it's interesting because Dickens, this is the book we've talked about, that there are notes in the back. And it talks about, he was in a train derailment in 1865 in real life, Dickens. This short story was pubbed in 1866. And it was in his magazine called All the Year Round magazine at a time when the magazine was in decline, is what it says in the notes. And I'm thinking, well, if this story is any indication, I kind of get it. Not to be mean, Mr. Dickens, but it's just not a very interesting story.
No, not at all, especially compared to the previous story in this collection, which also appeared in that same issue of the magazine. So I'd be kind of curious if people wrote in to comment. I wonder if people did that with some of these more ephemeral type magazines.
Ooh, look at you.
Fancy.
Well, I was going to ask you, Miss Archivist, if you've ever looked for this magazine.
This one I have not, but maybe that's what I'll do.
Yeah.
I can search that a bit. It came up in, did it come up when I was reading A Tale of Two Cities, maybe? It might have been mentioned in there because he was, so hugely influential and popular, and associating your name with him was like, invitation into the big leagues. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's something to do. I'll mess around with that.
Yeah, because I'd be curious to know why the magazine went into decline, is the word they say here, right?
Publishing history wise, there are a lot of change in magazines and newspapers. There's like etchings started to be including as printing developed. So there were etchings and pictures that were added, and then more fancier, complicated illustrations came along, and people came to expect that. So if he had a magazine that was mainly more text-based and couldn't shift, or he didn't want to eat into his profits more or something, I don't know. But I guess, like you were talking about the TV personality, there's ebb and flow.
Right.
And there's always some fancy new magazine coming along.
Yeah, so maybe he just held on too long or something, or just wasn't willing or interested to change.
Yeah, I wonder, how old was he? So he died in 1870.
Oh, so this was 4 years from his death.
Yeah.
Oh, so that could be, he was in decline.
Right. Yeah, Dickens was born in 1812 and died in 1870. So that could have something to do with it, that he was just kind of done with it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes, so Sigelman, not our favorite.
Yes, but up next is Green Tea by Sheridan Le Fanu.
I'm so excited about this one.
Me too.
Because he's the guy who wrote Carmilla.
Exactly.
One of the early vampire stories. So super excited about this.
And if you're interested, as you know, there is the conversation on Goodreads about these short stories. We'd love for you to participate. That link is in the show notes, or on our bookcougars.com page. We have a Ghost Stories tab now that tells you all of these things, including the reading schedule.
Yeah, so if you're interested in commenting on Green Tea, we'll be recording that next episode, May 13th, so you can leave a comment or question on that Goodreads thread.
We also decided to dip into The Portable Feminist Reader, edited by Roxane Gay. We read one essay in common, and Chris read a separate one as well. Do you want to talk about the one you read on your own first?
Sure. I read the one by Eileen Miles called Being Female, and she talks about, in this essay, being a female. The first line is, "When I think about being female, I think about being loved." And it's not what you think she means by that, because she starts talking by how men, and one in particular, Paolo Pasolini, who was a queer male writer, had a violent death. He was able to do what he did because he had a mother who adored him. And so to think about being adored like that as a woman, as a poet, as a writer, when women's writing is usually dismissed. This essay is from 2011. And she talks specifically about how men do get more reviews. This was a really big thing during this time period when there was a report that came out about the vast inequality between books reviewed by men versus books by women. And then she's talking about poetry, which is, you know,
if it ever gets
reviewed. But back then it was very mainly female. And at one line she says, "That's who takes workshops. That's who gets MFAs. You can easily get some numbers there. And frankly, in the poetry scene, the women are the ones who are generally doing the most exciting work." And she goes into the why of that. So this was a short essay, and I really enjoyed it. It left me thinking a lot, and it made me want to revisit thinking about reviewing books by women. I mean, we tend to read a lot of books by women naturally.
Mm-hmm. And I do think that report had a significant impact.
Yes, it had a huge impact. So, you know what? For the next episode, we'll pull up that report and talk about it and see if there's been an update. Because one of the things this essay made me think about is, who's the editor of the New York Times Book Review? And what do they choose to review and not review? What biases do they have? And considering some of the controversy of recent editors, it makes me wonder what's going on now, today.
Yeah. So one thing we should mention with this Portable Feminist Reader is that it's separated into different parts. So the essay that Chris just talked about by Eileen Miles is in part 5, called Gender Considerations. The essay that we read in common is in part 7, Sexual Politics. There are 9 parts in this book. And the essay that we read in common is called If Men Could Menstruate by Gloria Steinem. And this essay came out in 1978. And it was semi-satirical, and it was in Cosmopolitan magazine.
Good old Cosmo.
Had you read it before, Chris? Because I hadn't.
I had. Okay. Yeah, I had like a while ago, and my sister used to have a Cosmo subscription. So I doubt I read it back then, because I doubt my sister had it back in 1978. She had it more in like the 80s, I think.
Okay.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
But I did read it at some point in my college days.
It's very short. It's like 2.5 pages in this collection. So I don't know how it was printed in the magazine. It'd be kind of interesting to see the original.
Oh, now that's something to track down in the archives for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I bet you it's been digitized. I'll try and find that.
So what did you think? Because I'll start with one of my impressions of it was that we talk about menstruation so much more now than they did in 78. And they being women, just with each other. You know, it's not hidden the way that it used to be. But that's not the point of what she's saying in this essay. What she's saying is, what if men did? How would it be treated?
Right. She said men would brag about how long and how much. I mean, she has a lot of funny lines in here, but she highlights a lot of the myths and stereotypes, you know, that it makes you weak, it's dirty, it's disgusting, it should be hidden. There are religious restrictions against it for women. But if men menstruated, it would be celebrated.
Right. So what I think is interesting is thinking about it in the year 2025, where it's just not secretive the way it used to be, I think.
Right.
That this essay, to me, reading it feels different than I would imagine it would have read if I read it in 1978.
Right. And I'm wondering, too, like when tampons came in, because tampons were a big game changer. Yeah. And I remember like toxic shock syndrome was a really big issue. One of my aunts had it, and women were hospitalized from it because there wasn't a lot of protocol and understanding about using tampons, I think. And tampon technology has gotten a lot better since then.
Well, now there's things like the cup where you don't even need to use a tampon, which is much healthier for your body and the environment.
Right.
Menstruation has come a long way since 1978.
It really has. I mean, this is the height of the women's movement, right? When a lot of things were being discussed. And I mean, it was really funny because she has some cultural TV shows that were huge back then, like talking about Happy Days.
Yeah, I love
like
that.
This is funny. It says, TV shows would treat the subject at length. Happy Days. Richie and Potsy try to convince Fonzie that he is still the Fonz, though he has missed 2 periods in a row.
I laughed out loud when I read that. That was great.
And one that made me laugh, too. Even vampires made it into this short essay. Vampires would have been our first freedom fighters, because she talks about, so if men menstruated, it would be a badge of honor. But then how would women react to that? They would see it as part of the cause of their own oppression, that they didn't have that, you know? So she explores a lot of the different ways of seeing this from, I hate to say both the pro and the con, but kind of the pro and the con, the flip sides of it for gender. And that struck me because I noticed, too, that this was in the sexual politics when I thought it should have been more in the gender, but no. It shouldn't be. It's in the sex, because menstruation is related to biology, which is more of a sexual function than gender is.
Politics, too. I mean, it's used a lot in a political way against women, I think. So I think that's part of why it's there. And it was her semi-satirical way of poking at that.
Oh, my God. And it just makes me think. I just had this flash of like what was going on in that time period. And I think it was in the 70s that women were not allowed to run marathons. You know, men thought they were too weak to do that. So women started running marathons, of course, because women can. And there was one famous race where a woman finished it with blood running down her legs, but like she kept trucking, you know, and just how empowering that was and how it freaked out a lot of people.
Oh, so interesting.
But she wraps up so much into this. It's politics, it's patriotism, it's religion.
Pop culture.
Yeah, so much in such a short essay.
Yeah.
So impressive.
Yeah, The Portable Feminist Reader, edited by Roxane Gay. We're going to be dipping into this more.
Yeah, listen to me. I've read 2 essays so far. I put the date that I read them.
Oh, smart.
Yeah, like right at the front. And then I put a check next to it in the table of contents. And I thought, I'm just going to bounce around in it unless, there's something you and I want to read together. I'll be more intentional about it. But great book.
Yeah. Well, also read was Paris Undercover by Matthew Goodman. And I did also listen to the audiobook, which is narrated by Christy Burns. She does a great job. And Matthew's at the end of this episode, so we're not going to talk very much about the book. But what we did want to do is we talked to Matthew about his writing style, which is narrative nonfiction. And we meant to read a little bit of the book so you could get the idea of what narrative nonfiction is. And we didn't.
Yeah, well, especially when it's done so well.
Yes, exactly. So this is chapter 13, and I'm just going to read the very beginning of it. The autumn rains began to fall. The weather grew colder, the days shorter. The light over Paris dimmed. On the streets, the floral pastels of the glorious springtime had been replaced by muted shades of gray, brown, blue. Many French women, of course, were still smartly dressed, wearing patterned jackets with fur pieces draped around their shoulders, complicated hats adorned with feathers and beads. Sprinkled among them in the crowds were the young German women who had been relocated to Paris to operate the wireless transmitters, telegraphs, and phone switchboards required by the occupying power. Hair neatly pulled back into buns, they dressed in trim gray uniforms with peaked side caps like airline hostesses, and immediately became known among Parisians as the Soirée Grise, gray mice. Pardon my French pronunciation. I don't speak French. So I read this to the gentleman caller, and I said to him, do you think this is fiction or nonfiction? And he said, oh, that's fiction. And I said, no, it's narrative nonfiction. And what Matthew talks about, the author, is that everything he writes is true. He looks at a newspaper to find out what the weather was like that particular day in Paris. And then he writes in a style that puts you there as if you're reading historical fiction, but it is nonfiction. Mm-hmm. It's beautiful.
Totally. Yeah, it really helps you understand the time period and what was going on in a different way. Like you can see yourself there. He's painting a picture, and you can also imagine yourself in these people's shoes in a way.
Right. And I will just also issue a little content warning that there are some difficult things to read. As Matthew says, he's writing about the Nazis. It was not a pretty time in history, but really worthwhile read.
Totally. So in a nutshell, the book is about two women who were friends who both are arrested by the Nazis for helping soldiers escape from behind enemy lines. And they're imprisoned. One of them is eventually released, writes a book. The other woman is still imprisoned. And there are consequences from that book. So it's a shocking story. It's another book about a book in a way.
It is. Yeah.
Which just makes me appreciate books and their power being positive, sometimes negative.
Right.
Both ways.
Yeah. Paris Undercover, A Wartime Story of Courage, Friendship, and Betrayal by Matthew Goodman.
Enjoy our conversation with him, as Emily said at the end of the episode.
Biblio Adventures. We got to do some adventuring together.
We did. We went up to Mystic, Connecticut, to see Maura Casey with her book launch,
Saving Ellen, which is a memoir. This is her first book. She has been a journalist for years, but this is her first book.
Yeah, and the launch was at Bank Square Books, their new location in Mystic. And she had a great turnout.
She did. I mean, she's local to that area, and I just think very well known. Also, one whole section of the crowd was her writing partners. She's in a writing group.
Writing group. And her brother was present. Her husband came. I mean, she's such a character in a way. I hope that doesn't sound condescending or anything.
No,
like, does it? I mean, when you call somebody...
She's Irish. She has the gift of gab.
Yeah.
She's funny.
She has such a presence about her that it's just like you're drawn to her and you want to listen to her stories. We did a video with her over on BookTube. We'll put a link in the show notes to that. You'll see what we mean. She's a no-nonsense, great personality.
Yeah, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting was she talked about how there is a part of the book where she talks about her own sexual assault. And she mentioned, was it On Writing by Stephen King? I think that was the craft book she read that said you need to write about it outside of the writing you're doing actually on the book. You know, do the writing you need to do and then come back to the draft of the book and then write. And she mentioned that she wrote something like 25,000 words or something about this situation that happened, and then went back to the book, and I think it was like 400 words that ended up appearing in the book.
Yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting way to understand how a writer needs to face certain things, especially when you're writing memoir, in order to then be able to put it in a way that's digestible and enough for the reader.
Yeah, and that doesn't overwhelm the story that you're trying to tell, because the story is about her sister.
Right.
Yeah.
She spent time talking about how the book came to be, which if you go to our video that Chris is talking about, you could see her tell that story again as if you were there at the event that we went to. So we highly recommend that you watch that video.
Yeah, really good. We had a great day in Mystic. We met up with our friend Kate, who drove up from the Bronx, had a lovely lunch, and then we went to the gorgeous Mystic Noank Library, one of our favorite libraries in Connecticut, if not the world. It is so beautiful, where Kate and I had a conversation about our most recent buddy reads. We read a classic together every quarter. So we finally discussed The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, which we hadn't gotten to from the last quarter of 2024. And we also discussed our first book of this year, which is Old New York by Edith Wharton. And Emily hung out in the library. I saw her over there working on her laptop.
Yes.
Yeah. So then we all trucked over to Bank Square Books and had a lovely browse before the event with Maura Casey. Then we saw Matthew Goodman at the Guilford Free Library, which is our local library, and our local independent bookstore, Breakwater Books, was there selling his book.
Yeah, he had a good turnout. He's from New York City, and so he had some friends, including a dear friend that he had grown up with, I think from the age of 6 or something, showed up. And he actually has a friend who lives in Guilford, so he had a nice turnout.
Yeah. And there were people who he didn't know, and he's
Yes.
like, this is the best kind of crowd. People you don't know and people you do know.
Right.
Yeah. So really good talk.
Yeah, it was really nice to hear him. He was afraid, he said to us, because he talked to us earlier in the day, and he said, don't come tonight. You're going to hear me say all the same things. But it wasn't true. He had more to say.
Yeah, and people ask good questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was really nice. And then the third thing we did was celebrate Independent Bookstore Day together.
Yes. We went to Breakwater Books. That was our first stop.
Yes, that's where I bought my copy of Leaving by Roxana Robinson. And this is a fun story. My daughter Rachel, who now lives in Connecticut, and my granddaughter Nina also went to Independent Bookstore Day, but they went to Wesley and R.J. Julia in Middletown. And when we compared notes at the end of the day, Rachel said, Mom, I bought this really cool book for Nina. It's an Indestructible. And I bought 2 of those same books at Breakwater, like mine.
Yeah.
They're these really cool, really thin children's books that are indestructible. They can get wet. You can't tear them.
They're
very
non-toxic,
cool.
so
non-toxic.
babies can chew on them and not worry about dyes or anything harming them.
Yeah, and at Breakwater, they had a really cool end cap, cloth end cap or something that had them in, so they were front and center, and I had seen them once before. As a matter of fact, I think I bought one for a baby shower. And so it was fun to get a couple, but I thought that was so funny when Rachel called me and
That's
was
great.
so excited to report.
Yeah, Nina had her first independent bookstore day. That was really cute photos that she posted. So I purchased a book called The Originalism Trap, How Extremists Stole the Constitution and How We the People Can Take It Back. This is by Mediba K. Denny. I saw this book at work just the other day, and I took a photo of it. That's my new thing. Instead of checking everything out, I was like, take a photo of it. You'll read it this summer. So when I saw it there and I wanted to buy something to support Independent Bookstore Day, I got it. And I love the dedication, which is to my mother, who knew I would write a book long before I did, which I thought was lovely.
Yeah.
So then after Breakwater, which was really hopping, busy, lots of people in and out, getting their passports stamped. Danny, the owner, was running around like mad, filling up displays because things were moving out really quickly, which is great to see.
Yeah, and we picked up our copies of the Connecticut passport there at Breakwater, which has 23 bookstores listed in it this year.
Yes, I guess they list the sponsors, and the University of Chicago Press, Book Trib, Gallison, Kingdom of Threads, and Descent Pins are all sponsors or were sponsors of this year's Independent Bookstore Day. So on the back of our passport is a cover of a new edition of The Odyssey by Homer that the University of Chicago Press put out.
Yeah, and we got our first stamp at Breakwater. We are not going to do, well, it's already passed, can't get to 23 bookstores in one weekend, but we're going to do the slow crawl, which means we're going to try to get to all 23 by Labor Day, which is September 1st this year, I think.
Yeah, so I'm excited about that. I love these passports too. You know, it has the book, store name, their location, and then the date you visited, who you visited with, what you purchased, favorite feature, special moment, lots of things you can add.
And then they each have 3 suggestions of places down below of other stores in the area you can go to, which is kind of nice if some of them list restaurants, which I think is nice, and some of them list other shops.
Yeah, coffee shops, bakeries. Yeah, we'll take advantage of these recommendations.
Yes, and so we also hopped in the car and went down the road and went to R.J. Julia Booksellers on the same day, and they were celebrating their 35th anniversary, so they had extra fun things going on for Independent Bookstore Day. And we bought things there as well, which was really nice. They were taking donations. Read to Grow is a nonprofit that Roxanne Cody, who started RJ's, started years ago, which gets books into the hands of children, starting with newborns. And they were taking donations. So I bought a Pippa the Pig book and put it in there. And then what else did I get? Oh, I got these really cool cards that are based on the concept of origami. So it's one piece of paper, kind of like airmail. Remember that they might even still make those. I don't know. That's all one piece. So you write your letter and then just fold it up and put a stamp on it. And I've been eyeing them at different bookstores. So I took Independent Bookstore Day as the day to actually finally buy some.
Nice. Yeah. And I was on the hunt for a new Leuchtturm 1917 journal, and they almost always have them there. I like the yellow with the dot paper is my favorite. So I got that. And then I got a gift that I cannot talk about.
Keeping it to herself. Well, I also went to Cherry Jubilee in New York City and got to see Gloria Steinem, who was the keynote speaker. Cherry Bomb is a media business that's focused on women in the food and beverage area. And they have a magazine, a quarterly magazine, and then they also do this Cherry Jubilee where they bring women in who have new cookbooks. There's tons of cookbooks authors, and then they also have just a ton of food and drinks. It's wonderful. It happens in New York City once a year. For the first time, they're going to do one in LA. And the cookbook author that really stood out to me, all of them were great, but the one that stood out was Ozma Khan with her new book, Monsoon. And she owns a restaurant called the Darjeeling Express in London, which I would love to go to. She also is featured on Chef's Table. I'll put a link in the show notes to her episode. Her story is really poignant. She was a second daughter in India, and they don't want second daughters in India. They want boys. And so she wasn't treated very well, and she tells her story. And her story is that she ends up becoming a very successful restaurateur. This cookbook is so beautiful. It has gold filament on it. And her breakout session where she was talking to Carrie, who is the founder of Cherry Bomb, was really poignant and also a shot in the arm to women of be who you want to be, do what you want to do. You can make it happen. And then Gloria Steinem came in at the end, 91 years old. She was in conversation with someone who is a collaborator for her with her writing. And she was very funny because she is not a foodie. She made that clear, and she knew her audience. So one of the biggest laughs was, for some reason, she was talking about her love of tuna sandwiches, But she said, I want to make it clear, I never have made one. I go down to the bodega down the street and get one. So it's like, not only do I not cook, I really appreciate being in New York where I can get anything I need down the street. But it was really great to hear her speak. Here we just read this essay that she wrote in 1978. It's the year 2025. Women's rights are not going in the right direction. When she wasn't angry, she was very matter of fact about needing to fight the good fight and what we need to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's made her successful all these years. She's not someone who's rage-filled. She's someone who's very intellectual and matter of fact.
Right. And backlashes are inevitable. I mean, that's political reality. So I think she knows that. And right. as a student of history, she posted a picture recently on Instagram. They had a lot of Margaret Fuller in the background, which made me happy to see.
Oh, very cool.
So, I mean, she's somebody I grew up with. I've never met her. Laura used to teach her yoga when Laura lived in New York in the 80s and 90s with a group of women. But, I can't imagine life without the name Gloria Steinem.
Yeah.
Because she has been so instrumental and so in the news. And I remember subscribing to Ms. Magazine always.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My mother subscribed and I read it for years. I felt like it was a real honor to be there. I mean, I'm sure she is slowing down and can only do so much. And I go to Cherry Jubilee as a volunteer. And that means I'm working the event. I help keep the cookbook author signing line going and things like that. So I got to be in the inner sanctum of this big catering facility. I was in the hallway watching her get on the service elevator. They're not going to make her go down into the crowds and all of that. And it's like, wow, thank you. I just felt so grateful to be in the same room as her and just that she's done so much for us.
Totally. And now how tall is she? Is she very tall?
Well, she's using a cane and a little hunched over. And she also was introduced by Padma Lakshmi, who's very tall. I mean, look, I'm 5'1", so right? Most people seem tall to me. So she definitely didn't look that tall in the situation that I saw her, but I'm not sure how tall she was in her younger years.
I'm always curious about that. Being a short person, it's always interesting when you meet somebody who's not tall.
Yes.
It's like, oh.
Yes.
It's like meeting Fiona Davis, and it's just like, hey, how's the weather up there?
Yes, exactly.
She's so tall.
And then I got to meet Noah Adams, who was a longtime NPR contributor, and he wrote books as well. And he's my height. And it's like he's got this big booming voice, so I was kind of shocked. Yeah.
Interesting. I love that. I love meeting people.
Yes.
Or just seeing them in real life.
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh, there's a body and a face.
Yes.
We also had a really great Biblio adventure on Zoom with our patrons talking about poetry on our most recent reading salon.
Yes. The reading salon takes place the fourth Sunday of the month, and it's for people who contribute $5 or more. Via Patreon. We're really appreciative of all of you. And this was a really wonderful conversation. I think some people were a little nervous.
I was. You just don't know how things are going to go with poetry,
That's true. That's true. But we had people read beautiful poems and talked to us about how they access poetry, how they get more poetry into their life. People recited poems that they had to memorize in elementary school and middle school. Mm-hmm. I didn't have a teacher that made me do that. It was really great.
Yeah, it was a really good conversation. Even the person who said, I don't really read poetry, shared a beautiful piece of poetry. So I think sometimes we don't realize how much poetry is around us.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah.
I think that's true. That's a good point. Yeah. Really fun. And on our next reading salon, which is May 25th, we're going to be talking about our plans for reading big books this summer, which are books over 400 pages.
Yes. Each summer, Sue Jackson, who has a book blog called Book by Book and is also on BookTube, does Big Book Summer from Memorial Day to Labor Day, reading a book or more that's 400 pages or more. You can participate officially in her challenge. She doesn't have the links up yet, but she will at some point in May, and we will share those around on our socials because it's just a fun way to come together with other people who like big books. You can sometimes find somebody to do a buddy read with you of a big book.
Yeah, historically, Chris and I have done buddy reads. For us, that just means we put a thread on Goodreads so that you can read along with us if the book we've chosen to read is interesting to you or something you've been wanting to read.
Yeah, I have a stack that I've been kind of messing around with. There's some really big ones, like The Power Broker.
Oh my gosh.
By Caro.
Isn't that like 1,000 pages?
It is huge.
Yeah.
It is so huge. And I bought a hardcover. I bought the anniversary edition that's a hardcover. And I was like, what was I thinking? I was so enthusiastic about spending my holiday gift cards that I received that I was just like, wee!
Well, maybe you just need to own it and stroke it a little bit and then listen to the audiobook.
Right? Or get it on my e-reader or something like that. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, who knows? Maybe I'll read the hardcover and it'll just be a brick that I carry around with me all summer.
We'll find out. Chris, why are you leaning sideways?
I know, right?
What book is in your tote bag?
I gotta go to the chiropractor again.
So what about upcoming jaunts? What do you have?
I have a gorgeous day coming up tomorrow, which will be past by the time this episode goes live. I get to accompany Emily Fine to New York City to spend a day with Aunt Ellen.
I am so excited.
I can't wait.
We're supposed to have beautiful spring weather. That should be lovely. We're going to hop on the train as we do and get off at Grand Central and then go to the Morgan Library.
Yes, the Belle de Costa Green exhibit that they've been running ends in early May. So I'm really glad we're going to get in to see it. It's been on my wish list.
Yes. And then we're going to grab something to eat and maybe do a little sitting somewhere beautiful in the spring sunshine. And then go to Symphony Space for selected shorts, classics revisited. And Meg Wolitzer is the host, with a lot of other people that will report back after we see it.
Yeah, I have no idea what to expect.
Me either.
Yeah.
Yeah, classics revisited. I don't know what that means, but we're going to find out. And then, of course, we also have our Connecticut passports. We're going to be reporting back on that as we get to see bookstores that are listed. I told Chris one of my ideas is maybe to order books that I want from various bookstores, so that'll kind of force our hand to actually get in the car and go.
I love that idea. And I was looking at the passport image with the state of Connecticut and then all of the bookstores pointed out here. Mm-hmm. And I thought we can divide the state up into quadrants.
Oh, that's a fun idea.
You know, and like one day, if we go down to the corner towards New York City, we could see like 7 stores in a day, possibly, you know? So...
Ooh, we'll be reporting back on that. And then I also am registered on May 20th at 6 o'clock at RJ Julia in Madison. Sarah Moon's going to be in conversation with her mother, Amy Bloom, and they're going to be celebrating love and acceptance. Sarah has a new book called Family Week. It's a novel. I read her novel Middletown, which was her debut, and I really enjoyed it. So I'm looking forward to getting a copy of that and seeing them in conversation together.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So, Emily, what about upcoming reads? What's on your radar?
I have a book I'm very excited about. Look at this cover, Chris.
Oh, I love that.
It's these 2 little birds sitting on fence posts, like wooden fence posts, and it's called The Correspondent by Virginia Evans. This is a debut novel. It's an epistolary novel. And I'm just going to read this little part. This is on the inside flap. Imagine the letters one has sent out into the world and letters received back in turn are like the pieces of a magnificent puzzle. Isn't there something wonderful in that? To think that a story of one's life is preserved in some way, that this very letter may one day mean something, even if it is a very small thing to someone. Sybil Van Antwerp has throughout her life used letters to make sense of the world and her place in it. Most mornings around 10:30, Sybil sits down to write letters to her brother, to her best friend, to the president of the university who will not allow her to audit a class she desperately wants to take, to Joan Didion and Larry McMurtry to tell them what she thinks of their latest books, and to one person to whom she writes often yet never sends the letter. Yes.
I wonder how the birds are going to play into that if they do, because that is a sweet cover.
Yeah, I couldn't tell when I got it if it's just how birds chitter chatter back and forth to each other, and that's kind of like a metaphor for sending letters. I don't know. I will let you know. And then I also have Speaking of graphic memoirs, Feeding Ghosts, a graphic memoir by Tessa Holes. And this is about 3 generations of Chinese women, a granddaughter, mother, and grandmother. It's black and white, the art. And this is her first book, Tessa Holes' first book. What about you?
I have a graphic novel as well on my coming up reads here. It's called Renegade Girls, a queer tale of romance and rabble-rousing. It is written by Nora Noose and illustrated by Julie Robine. And it is about 2 women in late 19th century New York City. It's based loosely on 2 women and a third woman who's made up. And I cannot wait to dig in. The illustrations are very colorful. And what's interesting is she takes these 2 known women historically and mashes them together as lovers. One of them was queer, I think, and the other one, who knows? So I thought that was an interesting choice because the woman who was queer had a life partner, I believe. And then the third character that she makes up is kind of a bunch of women she's known in her life. She comes from a family of Italian immigrants. So, yeah, I'm super looking forward to this. A swoon-worthy queer romance set against a riveting saga of social change in 1888 New York City. And then I wanted to give a shout out to a book that I think a lot of people might be interested in. It came out last year. It's A Well-Trained Wife, My Escape from Christian Patriarchy by Tia Levings. I heard an interview with her on Heart of the Story podcast, which is a podcast by the writer Nadine Kennedy Johnson. And one of the things that she said that really struck me and has stuck with me is that patriarchy never invents anything new. It does the same thing over and over again. And another thing she said was that visibility in patriarchy is safety for women. And so those are things I want to hear more about. A friend on Instagram posted about having just read it and really recommending it. But she said it's very much more a memoir than getting into any of these issues directly. So that podcast episode, we'll put a link in the show notes to that because I was really interested in that. And I wonder, hearing you say how Gloria Steinem has just kept going and she's not angry, because I wonder if it is kind of like it's the same thing over and over and over. And that if we just keep doing our thing in force, in mass, and not believe the lies, we'll get back there again.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Got there once.
I know.
Yeah.
The thing is, that's how we grew up, you know? Growing up in the 70s and 80s, I remember watching Billie Jean King whip some ass on TV.
Yeah.
You know? So.
Yeah. Well, in the Out Now category, these are books we've talked about on past episodes, but were not published at the time. We have Little Great Island by Kate Woodworth and Love is for All of Us by James Cruz and Brad Peacock. And both of those books pub on May 6th, the day that this episode drops. Next up, enjoy our conversation with Matthew Goodman about his book, Paris Undercover.
We wish you all lots of happy reading. We are thrilled to be here today with Matthew Goodman. Matthew was on a prior episode 95, way back February 4th, 2020, to talk about his then new book, The City Game. He's joining us today to talk about his new book, Paris Undercover, a wartime story of courage, friendship, and betrayal. Welcome back, Matthew.
Well, thank you. I'm so happy to be back, and I can't believe that I'm the only person to have been in both of your headquarters, the old one and the new one. I feel so privileged and honored to have that status. So thank you.
Our pleasure.
Yes, and we're so happy to be here with you again today to talk about Paris Undercover. This is another work of narrative nonfiction. Can you tell us what narrative nonfiction is, what this book is about?
I think of it as narrative history. I mean, there are all kinds of narrative nonfiction, you know, that encompasses memoir and personal essay and journalism and so forth. My books I think of as narrative history because they're historical stories, but they are all true. They are nonfiction, but I write them in a novelistic way, so that I'm writing history using the techniques that are commonly associated with fiction. So when I sit down to write a book, I am very much thinking about the sorts of things that a novelist would be thinking about. So I'm thinking about who are the main characters, what's the narrative arc of the story, what's a proper structure for the story, what is the how do I maintain forward momentum? How do the characters change over the course of the story and so forth? So, I want the reader to be able to sort of pick up the book at a random page and read it and not necessarily know if they're reading a novel or if they're reading a work of nonfiction. Having said that, everything in the book is true. I'm not making anything up. If I say that it rained on a particular day, it rained on that particular day because I went and I looked at the newspapers or whatever it is to find out that it rained. Everything that's within quotation marks in the book is taken from a historical document. I'm not making up dialogue. This was in a newspaper report, or this was in an oral history, or, what have you. So basically, they're historical stories told in a novelistic manner, I guess, would be the best way to describe it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
So what grabbed you about Etta and Kate?
Right. This is a story about these two women, Etta Shiber and Kate Bonnefous. I guess the French pronunciation would be Bonnefous, who were living together in Paris in the year 1940. They had been living together since the late 1930s. They were two kind of ordinary women, middle-aged women, retired, who, had 3 Cocker Spaniels and they would take their dogs to, walk them in the Parc Monceau or the Bois de Bouillon or what have you. And they had a small group of friends, and, they liked to sort of walk along the Seine and, shop among the bouquinistes there, the booksellers, and, go to the movies and so forth. And then what happened was the Nazis invaded, and, World War II started, and then the Nazis came in June of 1940. And these two seemingly very ordinary women, not remarkable in any particular way, ended up doing something really remarkable, which was that they created, really from scratch, an escape line that ended up saving dozens and dozens of Allied servicemen. They transported them, they hid them in their apartment in Paris and transported them out of occupied Paris across the line of demarcation into unoccupied France. And then from there, these men were able to return to England and rejoin the war. So when I found out about that story, I read an article about it, and I thought, this is amazing. I've not heard about these two women, and, how remarkable it is that these are not, the sort of typical Mata Hari kind of young, glamorous, sexy spies. These are, older. Basically, they were always referred to as elderly women, at that time. They were, of course, 58 and 62. So I resented that, immediately. But, women of a certain age, that was the other way that they were described, so they were the sorts of women who tend not to be written about very much, in historical accounts. And I just kind of wondered what it was about them that enabled them to sort of tap into inner resources that they didn't necessarily know that they had prior, and to accomplish things that maybe they hadn't believed that they would even be able to accomplish, and to really risk their own very safe lives and their security in so doing. Well, let me say one other thing, which is that one of the women, Etta Shiber, was eventually returned to the United States after they were arrested and went to Nazi prisons. And when Etta returned to the United States, she was approached by some people to write a memoir about her experiences in Paris during the war. And she did. And she wrote a book called Paris Underground, which was a huge hit. It sold like 500,000 copies. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 18 weeks. And so when I found out that she had written a memoir, I was even more excited because, for a narrative historian like myself, a memoir is kind of like gold, because it gives you the inner life of the character as well as the outer life. So you know what she's thinking and feeling all the way through all of this. So I was just really excited. And then I will just mention that I read that memoir and it was fantastic. And I thought, my God, this is just incredible stuff. And then it was only much later in my process that I discovered that not everything in that memoir was really true.
Yes.
So that definitely changed my approach to the material. I mean, they really did do all of the stuff that I just said, but it's a much more complicated story in real life than you would think.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And Emily and I were talking earlier today. We recently had on Ruth Franklin talking about her new book, The Many Lives of Anne Frank. Mm-hmm. And she's very adamant that even though Anne did revisions and everything, it's all still factual, it's nonfiction. There's nothing fictional about the Diary of Anne Frank. So we were struck by you talking in this book about how her memoir, Paris Underground, does contain fiction,
yes,
fictional elements. And then so we pulled up the first edition and we were curious about how it was marketed. And on the cover, it says, an American woman and a woman friend operated an underground through which many British soldiers escaped from France. And then the first sentence on the back of the jacket says, here's a true story of the war that makes the wildest imaginings of fiction writers look pale. So,
well, not exactly, because they were the wildest imaginings.
It is interesting, so we were just fascinated by, here's one writer we were talking with who was trying to make very clear that this is nonfiction. And then now you're dealing with this book that was supposed to be nonfiction that has some fictional elements.
Well, it's so interesting because I honestly, I really didn't anticipate this. I really thought this is going to be a book of daring and courage and, daring do. And it's going to be kind of an adventure story. And I was fully up for that, And, what happened was that Etta's book, which was published in 1943, came out during the war. And so the publishers didn't want to give any information to the Nazis that they might be able to use, intelligence and so forth. So they gave pseudonyms to all of the major characters in the book other than Etta herself. And so I, as the researcher, as the writer, historian, quote unquote, I had to sort of find out the real names of all of these people to begin with. And ultimately, I was able to do that. I was able to find out the real names of their co-conspirators and, who they really were in real life, and to attach names to a number of the sort of important British servicemen in the book who they save. But there was this one part of the book that I couldn't figure out. And it was actually the very beginning of the plot, really, the precipitating moment of the plot, which is that Etta and Kate, in her memoir, Etta and Kate are traveling south, fleeing the Nazi, the oncoming Nazi armies, like much of Paris was. They were sort of all in motion out of Paris. It was called the Exodus, l'Exode. And they stop that night at an inn in Orléans with their 3 dogs to get some food for their dogs. And as they're in this inn, the innkeeper kind of rushes over and says, do you speak English? Because there's someone here who can't be here. And it turns out to be this RAF pilot who's been trapped behind enemy lines and has been unable to get out, in the evacuation at Dunkirk. And he's going to get captured. In sort of an impulsive moment, the two women decide that they're going to throw him into the trunk of their car, which actually they did do in real life. They hid these soldiers in the trunk of their car and marched them through Nazi checkpoints and so forth. It was quite amazing. But they threw this guy, his name was William Gray in the book, the pseudonym was William Gray, into their car and brought him back to Paris. And it's the most famous scene in the book. When Reader's Digest excerpted the book, that was the scene that they excerpted. It was mentioned in all of the reviews. And I knew that William Gray wasn't his real name because everything was a pseudonym, but I couldn't figure out what his real name was. And I couldn't find any information about this guy. And the more I looked, the more frustrated I got. And eventually I began to wonder, is it possible that there just wasn't a William Gray? And then what happened was that I received this packet of letters that was given to me by Etta's grandniece. Etta was a very diligent and faithful letter writer, and she had written a series of letters to her brother back in the United States, upstate New York, Syracuse, in the months preceding the occupation and then immediately following the occupation. And it became clear reading these letters that that whole story about what had happened with them going down south to Orleans and finding William Gray and putting him in the trunk and bringing him back, that had not happened, that wasn't at all what they had done when they left Paris. In fact, they went west and they stayed there for 2.5 weeks and they didn't come back that night. And it just wasn't true. That had just been made up. And then I realized, okay, well, if that was true, it was untrue, then the next great scene in the book, which I had been so excited about, where their apartment gets searched by the Gestapo, and the pilot is there, and he's going to get caught, and they sort of have this impulse, and they dress him up as Etta's late brother, and they pretend that, that couldn't have happened because there was no William Gray. And so then this next thing also couldn't have happened. And I began to think, well, what in this memoir actually did happen, and what didn't? And what happened was that this memoir, which in the beginning, frankly, I had been afraid I was going to be too dependent on, that basically my book was just going to be a gloss on that book and basically saying to readers, read that book. That book is really a great book. That now it was an unreliable source. And I couldn't use any of the material in there unless I had some kind of independent confirmation. Sorry, this is a really long answer.
No, that's okay. It's fascinating.
No.
And I'll finish up by just saying that this was the moment at which I thought, I'm going to have to return the advance from the publisher, because I can't write the book that I had proposed, and I didn't know what to do because I had this hole in my narrative, and I thought, how can I possibly write a historical account when I don't really know what happened? Anyway, long story short, I was talking to a friend of mine about this very dilemma. It was really a dark period. I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I have this hole in my narrative. And she told me that she's a writer, and she told me that she had studied at NYU with E.L. Doctorow, one of my favorite novelists. And it was a fiction writing class. And E.L. Doctorow said to his students, if you have a hole in your narrative, don't run away from the hole. Point to the hole. And I was fascinated by that idea because it's so counterintuitive.
Right.
You think, why would a writer want to alert the reader to the fact that there's a hole in the narrative? But there was something about that really, I felt like there was an answer in there. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the whole process of how this memoir, this fictionalized memoir, how it and why it was written was really part and parcel of the story. And that you couldn't, in fact, really understand what had happened between Kate and Etta during the war and then after the war without also understanding the memoir and how it had come out and why it had come out in the way that it did. And then once I realized that was really part of the story too, then the whole book kind of fell into place. And I sort of figured out that, the first part was going to be about the real story of what they did. And then the second part was going to be about the publication of the memoir and so forth. So it was kind of tricky there for a while. But I do think that ultimately what I had thought was going to be just a book about courage and resistance is still that, but it's really a larger story about friendship and betrayal and means and ends and unintended consequences and so forth. So ultimately, I think it was for the best.
Yeah, as I was reading it, I was thinking about last year, our read-along theme was books about books. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, wow, this really became that because there is a section. So the first part of Paris Undercover is about how these two met and
Right.
their life in Paris, and then how they did start to rescue. Then there is a part where they are in jail,
Right.
which is very disturbing. And then there is a part where you talk about this memoir and also about the ghostwriters who helped
Yes.
write it.
Yes. It's an amazing story, and one, frankly, that has never been told before. You know, there was a period of time where I thought, I'm the only person in the world who knows this right now, you know? Because ultimately, I found out who it was who had written the memoir. It wasn't Etta, and it wasn't the people who it's attributed to on the title page, because the title page says Etta Shiber as told to or with Paul. What is it? You have it there.
Anne and Paul Dupree.
Anne and Paul Dupree, right? Well, there was no Anne and Paul Dupree. Anne and Paul Dupree was itself pseudonyms for a guy called Paul Winkler and his wife, Betty Winkler, who were, Paul especially was kind of a very famous agent and publicist. And he was the one who had approached Etta to write this memoir. But he didn't write it either. He farmed it out to a guy named Alatar Farkas, who was a Hungarian Jewish immigrant, refugee from the war. And what I discovered ultimately in the archives of Princeton University, right at the end of my research, was that he had sued Paul Winkler because he hadn't been given credit on the book. And in his suit, he had a very lengthy affidavit in which he itemized exactly how it was that he had written the book in the way that he did, and indicated that he had intended it to be a novel, not a work of nonfiction. And that he, as he put it in the book, a fraud has been committed upon the American public. Now, this case got settled out of court, and so none of that ever got released, okay? But it does exist in the archives. And in that affidavit, he itemized all of the characters that he had made up in order to write this book, including William Gray, the pilot. So that confirmed what I had suspected, was that that had just come out of his imagination. But the publishers decided that it would be better as a nonfiction book. And so a book that spent 18 weeks on the nonfiction bestseller list was, in fact, intended to be a novel.
Wow. And Max Perkins is involved.
Maxwell Perkins, probably the most distinguished editor in the history of American publishing, I would say, right? Who edited Fitzgerald and Thomas Wolfe and all those folks. He was the editor. Now, he was sort of hornswoggled himself. I don't think he was in on this, but he was taking the word of this guy, Paul Winkler, who was assuring him that this was all on the up and up. And Etta herself was sort of taken in. That's a whole other story, but one of the acts of betrayal in this book, I think, is that Etta herself was betrayed by this guy who was way more powerful than she was and way more wealthy and way more worldly. Etta was a very naive older woman who hadn't, she had lived in a 5-block square radius of New York City her whole life until she moved to Paris, and had never worked for herself and had always been taken care of by her husband and then taken care of by her friend Kate.
Right. And Kate was really the brains behind everything.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Etta
Kate
was a very nervous, anxious person that, ironically ended up in the front seat of a Fuego with helping people escape in the bag.
Exactly. She was the least likely person to do this kind of. So that, in fact,
it's kind of like me and Chris were doing it.
These were the resistance cougars, right? Exactly. The liberation cougars.
But I love this scene where, the war breaks out and Kate says, you should go back to America.
Right.
You're American. You should go back. You'll be safer. And she's like, no, I'm with you, you know?
Right.
And I'm staying here.
But you see that in her memoir you're talking about.
No, in your book you write something about that. No, this was in the memoir. I'm so sorry. I read the first chapter last night, so I'm confused now already.
That's right. No, but that's right. Well, let me say this. Kate, what was great for me as a writer was that the two main characters were similar in a lot of ways, but so different, in terms of their character. Etta was supremely shy and retiring and nervous and had been afflicted with anxiety her whole life and was just very sheltered. And Kate, on the other hand, was a kind of a spitfire. You know, Kate was British originally, but she had divorced her husband when she was quite young, which was very rare in England in those years. We're talking about the early 20s, late teens, actually. And had a child out of wedlock with her Italian lover, you know. So she had this quote unquote bastard child, and she had run her own business in France, which was very unusual in those days, at a time when women couldn't even control their own finances. They couldn't have a bank account in their own name. You know, she owned her own car, which was very uncommon. She drove ambulances during the war. She was really an amazingly independent-minded person. And Etta was kind of following along, you know, in her wake, but doing these things that there was no way she would have ever done on her own. So for me, it was great because it's much more interesting for the writer and, of course, for the reader to have two women who are different having to contend with the same situation, as opposed to two women who kind of always agree with each other. And, or, you know, like when I wrote 80 Days, Nellie Bly and Elizabeth Bisland, they were very similar about their race around the world in 1889. They were very similar. They were both young newspaper women, but, you know, very different in terms of their personalities and their interests and so forth. So for me, that was great. And so in this case, this was great too, that they were so different. But I will say one other thing about that, Chris, was that Kate did say that in real life to Etta, but she didn't say you're an American. She said you're a Jew. And that's another thing that never gets mentioned in the memoir. Etta Shiber was Jewish. And Jewishness only gets mentioned 4 times in this entire long book, this memoir, about the Nazis, right? And never in relation to Etta. And it took me some time to finally figure out that she was, in fact, Jewish. And it was confirmed to me by family members that she was Jewish. That makes a lot more sense for Kate to say, you should go back because you're Jewish, rather than because you're an American. But again, for reasons of marketing, the people who were in charge of this book didn't want to present Etta as a Jew. They wanted her to be kind of an all-American woman. And they felt that that would be muddied if she were presented as a New York Jewish woman rather than as a kind of all-American housewife, overweight, sitting on the front porch, you know, that kind of thing. So,
well, yeah, and I was going to ask, like, how much of this memoir do you think was part of, like, war propaganda?
A lot of it. Ultimately, the reason why Etta was convinced to do this, aside from the fact that she had no money left, you know, all of her money was confiscated by the Nazis as part of this judgment against her. You know, it was that she thought this was going to help the war effort, because this was 1942 when she was approached. The outcome of the war was very much in doubt in 1942. No one knew, what was going to happen. And the American support for the war was a little bit iffy. And even the Roosevelt administration didn't really want Americans to think that American boys were dying, you know, for Jewish lives. So they wanted to separate that. And so that was part and parcel of this whole thing, was that they didn't want to present their heroine as being Jewish, but rather as a kind of, you know, middle American housewife type. Having said that, if I can just say one thing, and maybe this is a spoiler, but the book came out, and the book made claims for Etta and Kate that weren't true, okay? Etta and Kate saved, I've identified 20 British servicemen who they did save in real life, and I have an appendix at the back in which I list the names and the units of the men that they saved. And they were important. I mean, this was really courageous on their part. You know, they really did do this. They really did hide men in the trunk of their car. They really did break men out of Nazi military hospitals. I mean, it is sort of amazing. And 20 is a lot. And these guys, you know, they didn't just go back to England and open a sweet shop, you know, in Manchester. They went back into the war, you know, and they were, you know, given medals and they performed heroically. One of these guys became a general, Brigadier General Derek Lang. So you can see the actual effect that they had on the war. But the book claimed that they had saved 150.
Almost 200.
That's what
the marketing material.
Right, the marketing, exactly.
Yeah.
The marketing people said 200, and then eventually it became 250.
Right.
And I'm thinking, the line was only in existence for 3 months. So there were 250 English-speaking men of service age walking through this apartment in 3 months. Like it's some brothel or something. It's impossible that, but there were sort of fantastical claims made for them in the course of the book. But, when the book came out and it was a huge hit, Kate was still in a Nazi prison at that time. And the Nazis read the book, and the Nazis believed the book because, like you said, Chris, at the beginning, it's claimed that everything in this book is true. The publisher said that. So the Nazis thought, we have a woman here who has rescued 150 men and all the other things that the book claims for her. And they tortured her as a result of that, as a result of the book coming out, and sentenced her to death as a result of the book coming out. And what I discovered, which took me a while to figure out why this was, and it was only later that it all made sense, when Kate finally gets out at the end of the war and comes back to France, she's given a copy of the book, which is about her, which is dedicated to her, and she reads it. And the very next day, literally the next day, she goes to the British Embassy in Paris to inquire about the possibility of suing her friend Etta Shiber for the damage that had been done to her and to her comrades as a result of the publication of this book.
I was listening to that part on audio, and I was taking a walk, and I gasped when that part came.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And again, you can't understand why she would have done something like that unless you understand the context of this false memoir and what were the consequences. That wasn't what Etta had intended at all. She considered Kate to be the bravest person she had ever met.
Right. So let's talk about what happened to Kate.
Sure.
That after that, the part of the book goes to a chapter might even be the last chapter of the book. Kate ended up in pretty bad shape by the time that she had been in prison.
Right.
And I was wondering, that chapter was really difficult to read. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of abuse to humankind. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering how it was for you to write that.
That's a really good question, Emily. I really wanted to tell the truest story that I possibly could. Look, we're writing about the Nazis. We're writing about fascism. We're writing about totalitarianism, and we're writing about a resistance. When I say we, I mean me. I don't know why I'm saying we. I don't refer to myself usually in the third person. But Matthew Goodman was... So I knew that I was going to have to sort of describe that. And I wanted to sort of give honor to Kate in the sense that she went through a lot of really terrible stuff and came out and endured it. She was just remarkably tenacious, remarkably strong, remarkably patriotic, and strong-minded. She endured horrible things, but she triumphed. She survived. She ended up having grandkids who she was a great-grandmother for, and she won medals from both the French and the British armies, and she lived to be almost 80 years old and was very matter-of-fact in that kind of British way, about what she had done. But, I met her, I spoke to her 2 grandsons, one of whom lives in France and one of whom lives in Portugal, and they adored her. She was a great-grandmother, and they kind of knew that our grandmother did something amazing that people don't really know about, and they really wanted people to know about the story of their really heroic grandmother. And so, the way to do that is to tell the true story, not just of Kate, but of the other women, the political women who she was in prison with. She wasn't in a concentration camp. She was in a prison for political prisoners. She was one of what were called the night and fog prisoners, who were the political prisoners that Hitler, and her case ultimately went all the way up to Adolf Hitler and the Pope, as a matter of fact. Both the Pope and Hitler dealt with her case. These were the people who Hitler considered to be the most dangerous political enemies of the Third Reich. And, he thought, I don't want to execute them, especially the women, because that's going to create martyrs. And so we're just going to like send them into the night and fog. You know, they're just going to disappear and no one's going to know whatever became of them. And that's what happened to Kate and the other women that she was with. But they were amazing women because they were political, you know, so they knew, you know, they knew who they were. They knew why they were doing what they were doing. They worked together. They took care of each other. I found it really inspiring, you know, these amazing women, many of whom survived. And I'll just say one other thing, if I might, about that, which is that a lot of the material that I used in order to write this book was in French, so that I was reading oral histories or self-published memoirs by many of these women, you know, about their experiences and case files and so forth, which have never appeared in English before, you know. So I was very happy to be able to sort of bring these women into broader renown or awareness. Like, for instance, there's a part which is maybe like the hardest part of the book, I think, the Death March of the Women of Yawer, right? Which is so astonishing and has never appeared in English before. And I was so glad that my editor let me put it in, because it's not specifically about Kate, but it's about her comrades. But these women who were marching for, I forget, like 200 kilometers over the course of 6 weeks in 30 below temperatures and so forth, and they did it. It's just amazing. Yeah. And like now when I'm like walking home from parking my car, because I live in New York City, 5 blocks from my house, and I'm walking home, you know, and I'm really cold. I just think, these women marched for 200 miles in summer dresses and high heels.
Yeah,
you know?
And suffered a lot of abuse. Well, what I was thinking about, Matthew, is last fall, I took a walk in the East River Preserve, which is not far from where we're recording this, and came across a cemetery that I had never seen before. And I had walked there many times. And I was walking through and looking, and one of the gravestones said, "She was useful." And I turned to my partner. I was like, that is ridiculous. Like, who would write, "She was useful"? And then I took 2 steps and stepped on a bunch of acorns and went sliding down that hill on my ass. And I was like, okay. The ghost of "She was useful" was like,
she got
I was useful, lady.
That's really funny.
And instant karma. And what does Kate say in your book? I wanted to be useful.
Yeah, I wanted to be of use.
Yeah.
That's Harriet Beecher Stowe's family cemetery plot there.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think it was Harriet that they said she was useful.
Yeah, I don't think she's buried there, but
you know,
ghost karma.
Ghost karma. I mean, I was like, it hurt, but I was laughing when I got to the bottom of the hill, like, okay, she's still useful.
She's still useful.
Apparently.
She's teaching you lessons from beyond the grave. But Kate was useful, and she thought of herself in that kind of plain way.
Yeah.
You know, that she never thought of herself as a heroine. And in fact, you know, her grandson told me that when he would ask about her experiences during the war, she would just say in French to him, you know, "That doesn't concern you," you know. She kind of maintained a stiff upper lip about it. Yeah, so she was just an amazing person. And they both were really, I really grew very fond of them, you know, in the course of writing this book, you know, of both of them.
I was just going to say, it's so important, I think, in this day and age to have models like this of courage and strength.
Yes.
Even when somebody is quiet and shy and maybe doesn't put herself out there.
Well, like I said,
that when you're partnered with people who inspire you and who you want to support, you know, you bolster them, and then, you know, vice versa. I think it's just so important.
I mean, there were things that Kate wouldn't have been able to have accomplished without Etta being there, you know, distracting the guards while she was talking to the prisoner, you know, whatever it is. Like, Emily, your first question about what interested me to write this story to begin with. And we were talking about this a little bit before we started taping. You know, I started writing this book at the end of 2019, so it was kind of the last year of the first Trump administration. And I was fascinated by the whole idea of resistance and, you know, what does it take for people to resist encroaching authoritarianism? And now here we are, you know, in the beginning of the second Trump administration. And I think that those questions about how does one find the resources to risk oneself, to take a stand, to do what needs to be done in the face of fascism, I think is even more relevant today than it was then. It's not something that I write about per se in the book. I don't talk about contemporary stuff. I wanted to keep the reader in that space. But I think it's kind of the subtext, a little bit anyway, of the whole story.
Yeah. Emily and I have talked in the past, too, about, all these World War II books still coming out. But, that how now we're getting the stories of people on the ground, everyday people. It wasn't the soldiers' memoirs, and before that, the great men's memoirs, So it's so valuable to have their stories for us in terms of giving us strength. But then even the situation where here you were as a French reader and speaker to be able to translate the other women's experiences that people in the United States don't know about.
Right.
And it's amazing to me that there are still so many stories coming out.
I know. I was amazed about that. You're right. It is exactly right. I mean, one of the things that I was so struck by in thinking about this is that these were not trained people in any way. They worked with a priest very closely. They worked with a businessman. They worked with a farmer. He was really a peasant. He was really a sharecropper. He was the passeur, the guy who brought the prisoners down the Dordogne River and then walked them across the line of demarcation by foot. His name was Elie Tessier, illiterate peasant, really. These were not spies. These were not people who had been trained to do any of this. They were making it up as they went along. One of the French historians who I read described this as the artisanal phase of the escape lines. Later in the war, you had these kind of big escape lines, the Comet Line and so forth, that were transporting hundreds of people in and out, of France. But in the beginning, no, they were just sort of making it up as they went along. They were trying to figure out, how are we going to get them from the north of France down to Paris? We don't know. How are we going to get them from Paris down to Marseille? We don't know. How are we going to get false identity cards? They didn't have the slightest idea, I mean, Etta was a housewife. Kate was a shopkeeper. So they had to figure it out. And as part of the reason why these early escape lines, their lifespans were measured in weeks and months, not in years, because eventually, you got infiltrated or, whatever, and you went to prison. So that's what happened to them as well. But it is amazing about the ordinariness of all of this.
Yeah, and I appreciate one of the epigraphs you use about saving one person saves the world.
Right, from the Talmud, yeah. Right, the person who saves one person is as though they had saved the whole world. Yeah.
And I can see how marketing people would go from 20 people to 150 to 250.
Right.
Because America, bigger, better, all that kind of stuff.
Super size.
If they save 20, even better if they save 250.
Right. I know. Yeah. But just how important, every life is and what they did, as you said earlier, those people they saved went on to do other wonderful things.
And just had amazing lives, and I talked to a number of their children and grandchildren who are here because of that, with the fact that they were rescued. So that's amazing. There's another quote which I use as one of the epigraphs later on in the book about that if you hold a bee in your hand, it was written by one of these early resistance members. If you hold a bee in your hand, it'll sting you before it dies. And it's a very little thing, but if he didn't do that, then bees would not have survived up until today, right? So it's like we all do just one little thing, and it's not a major thing in itself. But if we don't do that, then we're not going to survive.
Right. We should probably let Matthew go. I'm going to ask one final question,
Sure.
and this is just kind of like a practical question. So I think a lot of people don't realize that the way a book like this comes to life is because you had written a book proposal at some point, and someone said, yes, please write that book. And so you had this moment when you're with a friend and you realize there's a hole in the story and you didn't have to give your advance back maybe. Did you have to rewrite the proposal and kind of rethink this whole project?
That's a really interesting question. I actually haven't been asked that question before. I didn't. Here's the thing. I am fortunate in the sense that, well, fortunate for many reasons, but in particular because I have been able to work with the same editor for 3 books, the same publisher, the same imprint, Ballantine Books, and the same editor, Susanna Porter, who's fantastic. You know, I've been working with her for 15 years, so she and I have become quite friendly. In fact, you know, friends. And I didn't have to rewrite the proposal, but I did feel obligated to call her up and say, this was during the pandemic, and say, hi, Susanna. Got something I want to talk to you about. You know, we're going a different way with this one, you know. And she was great. And she understood, I think, right away that this was actually a good thing. If I could pull it off, it was going to be a good thing, not a bad thing, because ultimately it's going to deepen the story and make it more interesting and make it in a way different from a lot of the books that are written about female spies or whatever in World War II, because this has this other added element of the fictionalized memoir. So that, I think, makes it a kind of a different story, you know, than has been told before. So no, I didn't have to actually rewrite the proposal, but I did have to sort of clear it with my editor beforehand. Yeah.
I think this is a really tricky time. We Cougars here try not to talk about politics too much, but we are in an interesting time in the United States. What do you hope people take away from reading this book?
You know, just what a great writer I am, I guess. No, I'm glad you both laughed at that. I'm glad. That's a tricky question, because what I try to do is to find the most interesting stories that I can and then try to tell them in the most interesting ways that I can and in the most truthful ways that I can. Like a kid, in a way. I mean, this is sort of a cliche, but, you know, your books are kind of like your kids, and then you kind of send them out into the world, and now they're on their own. And I certainly don't want to direct a reader toward having a particular take on the book or, you know, a particular takeaway from the book. But, you know, like I was saying earlier, I just think that it's important that we learn from the past. You know, the old line is that the past doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Or history, I guess, doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. You know, what's going on today is not the same as what was going on under Hitler in Germany by any stretch of the imagination. But there are things that, you know, in terms of taking a particular group of people who are weak and who are in some way estranged from the population at large and casting them as evil and throwing them into prisons and so forth. Well, there are echoes of that today, you know, controlling the media and all of that stuff. There are echoes of those things. And who knows what it's going to be like a year from now or 2 years from now. So without getting prescriptive about it, I just hope that people can sort of keep in mind the lessons of the brave people who have gone before us, you know, the people who have, in fact, sacrificed for freedom, you know, for democracy and all those other big words that actually are really meaningful. Honestly, it was my great good fortune and great privilege to have found these women and their comrades and to be able to tell their story, to have more people learn about them in a way to let their life interrogate our life, to think about what does their life and death teach us for us today, you know? So I guess just that.
Yeah.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much for another fantastic book.
I wish we could talk for another 2 hours.
Me too.
You know. Well, thank you so much for really, it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Book Cougars with Chris Wallach and Emily Fine. We'll be back again with another episode in 2 weeks. Until then, come chat with us on social media, Goodreads, or email us at bookcougars@gmail.com. If you'd like to help support our podcast, please tell others about us, leave a review wherever you listen, and consider becoming a patron. Even $1 a month is a big help. Learn more about that on our website, bookcougars.com, where you'll find the show notes for this and all of our past episodes.
Thanks, everybody.
This episode was edited by Pat Keogh Sound Design.